Hello, welcome to Storytime again from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes from Europe, and it is a story about a sister and a brother who loved each other so much that they would not be parted no matter what happened. Once, long ago, there was a brother and a sister. And one day, the brother came to his sister and he said, "Sister, our lives have been miserable since our mother died and our father remarried this horrible woman. I think she might be a witch, and I think our lives would be better if we just went out into the wide world and tried to find our own way." His sister didn't really like the idea of leaving her home, for the wide world seemed a little bit scary. But she did agree that it might be better to be out in the wide world rather than to be under the thumb of their horrible stepmother, who did seem to be possibly a witch. And so she agreed with her brother. She put her hand in his, and together they walked out into the wide world. They left their father's home and they walked across the meadow and they began to walk through the forest. But unfortunately, their stepmother, the witch, she was indeed a witch, had been watching them, unknown to them, and she had seen them leave the house, and she knew they weren't coming back, and she was not happy about that, for she had been using them as her slaves. And so she went ahead of them very quickly by her magic, and she enchanted all of the streams in the forest. Well, as the sister and brother were walking through the forest, the little brother said, "Oh my goodness, sister, I am so thirsty. I hope we get to a stream soon. I really need a drink." Well, before too long, they did indeed hear a stream. And as they came running up to it, very happy, for they thought they'd be able to drink, suddenly the sister stopped and she grabbed her brother and she said, "Brother, brother, do not drink the water." And he said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "I can hear the stream singing to me, and it is saying that whoever drinks of it will become a tiger. If you drink that water, you will become a tiger and you will tear me up to pieces. Please don't drink the water." Well, the brother did not want to become a tiger and tear his sister to pieces, and so he agreed that he would not drink the water. And now they knew that their stepmother knew they were gone. Well, as they continued through the forest, the brother was getting very thirsty again. And pretty soon they heard another stream. And so they ran up to this stream. And as they ran up to the stream, the sister heard the water singing to her again. And it said, "Whoever drinks of me shall become a wolf." And she said, "No, no, brother, please do not drink the water. The stream says that if you drink of it, you'll become a wolf. And I do not want you to become a wolf and tear me to pieces." And so again, the brother did not drink. But when they came upon a third stream, again the sister heard the stream singing to her. And the stream said, "Anyone who drinks of me shall become a fawn." And so the sister called out, "Brother, do not drink the water. You shall become a fawn and run away from me." But it was too late. Her brother was so thirsty that he had moved faster than she had, and he had already drunk of the water. And as soon as that water passed his lips, he changed. And instead of a boy, now was standing there a fawn. Well, the sister grabbed the fawn around the neck and she cried and the fawn cried. But finally they knew that they had to move on. And so the sister took off her belt that she was wearing and she put it around the fawn's neck very loosely, but just enough so that she wouldn't lose him. And then she took some reeds that were growing by the river and she wove them into a little cord that she could attach to her belt. And so she walked through the forest with the fawn on a little leash so that she would not lose her brother in the forest. Well, as they passed through the forest, they spotted a little hut off to the side. And they went up to that hut. And when they peeked inside, they could see that there were leaves and other things inside the hut. And it definitely looked as though no one had lived there for quite some time. And so the sister looked at her brother and she said, "Brother, I think we can probably live here." And so she went into the hut and she cleaned it out, and her brother, the fawn, helped her as much as he could. And they made the place cozy, and she went and she got some moss and some leaves and made themselves some comfortable beds in the corners. And every night they slept side by side on their little bed. And in the morning, the sister would go out, and thankfully, out in back of the house, she found a little well that had some good clean water in it that was not enchanted. And she would go out into the forest every day, and she would gather acorns and nuts and fruits and berries and everything she could find for herself to eat, and grasses and things for her brother the fawn to eat. And so they lived rather happily for a couple of years. And they both grew older and grew up. Well, one day, the king of that country decided to go for a hunt. He and his men and all of his court and his dogs and the hunters, they were going to go hunting deer in the forest. Well, when the little brother fawn heard the hunting horns in the forest, he was so excited by the sound of those horns that he really wanted to go find out what it was. He knew it was a hunt, but he really wanted to know who it was, and he wanted to join in and be part of the hunt. Well, his sister did not want to let him go outside, for she knew that they were probably hunting deer, and a fawn is, after all, a deer. And she was like, "I don't want you to go out there, brother." And he said, "But sister, it's so exciting, and I can't sit still, and the house is so small. Please let me go out. Please open the door." So finally she said, "Well, all right. I will open the door and let you go out, but with hunters and strange men about in the woods, I don't dare leave the door open. So I'm going to close the door after you and lock it. And when you come back, you must knock on the door with your hoof and say, 'Sister dear, let me in.' And then I will open the door and let you in. If you do not speak, I will not know it is you, and I will not open the door." And so her brother agreed, and she opened the door, and he dashed out and went running across the woods to find the hunt, and she closed the door and locked it behind him. Well, the fawn went running out to find the hunt, and when he found the hunt, the hunters spotted him. And they saw him, and they thought he looked like a fine catch, and so they began to chase him. But he was faster than they were, and he ran and he leaped and he chased and he ran and he circled about and he doubled back on himself, and he led them a merry hunt all day long. And at the end of the day, he managed to slip away from the hunt. And when he got to the hut, he knocked on the door with his hoof and he said, "Sister dear, let me in." And she opened the door and he slipped inside. And he was so tired from running after the hunt all day, running away from the hunt all day, that he slept quite well in his little bed. But the next morning, the king and his court came out hunting again, for they had not caught the deer they were chasing the day before, and they wanted to catch a deer. So they began hunting again, and they began blowing the horns and the hallooing of the hounds and the hunters. Well, Brother Fawn could not sit still again. And he begged and he pleaded with his sister until finally she said, "All right, I will open the door and let you go to the hunt. But please be careful. I do not wish to be left alone in this world because they've killed you. Please be careful. And remember, when you come home, knock on the door and say, 'Sister dear, let me in,' and I will open the door." And so she opened the door and he bounded out, and she closed it and locked it behind him. Well, this time the hunters were a little more used to the way he ran through the forest. And so he ran and he ran and he jumped and he ran and he tripped and all day the hunters chased him. But this time, one of them got a little bit closer than before, and he was wounded just a little bit in one foot, so that he ran a little bit slower. And one of the huntsmen caught up rather close to him, but he was far away from the rest of the huntsmen, and so he thought he would follow this deer until it got tired, and then he would capture it more easily. But much to his surprise, What he saw instead was not the deer getting tired, but the deer, once he had managed to slip away from most of the huntsmen and the sun was going down, ran to a little hut in the forest, knocked on the door with his hoof, and called out, much to the huntsman's surprise, for he had never heard a deer speak before. The little fawn called out, "Sister deer, let me in!" And the door opened, and the deer ran into the hut. Well, the huntsman thought this was rather odd, and so he went back and reported to the king what he had seen. And the king was very intrigued as well. He thought that was a bit strange also. And so he gave orders that on the next day they were going to go for a hunt again, but this time no one was to try to wound the deer. They must just let it run and follow it. Well, you can imagine how very frightened the sister was to find that her brother had been wounded in the foot. And so she put him right to bed, and she put some herbs and some ointments on his hoof to help it heal. And she put him to bed, and she made him stay there, and she told them that on the morrow he was not going out to join the hunt. But the wound really wasn't very bad. It had really only slowed him down because he'd been very tired from running about all day. And the next morning, he didn't feel the pain at all. In fact, he was so excited because the horns were blowing again and the hounds were baying again, and he wanted to go join the hunt. Well, his sister argued with him and argued with him and argued with him, and finally she gave in. She opened the door, and he ran out, and she closed it and locked it behind him. Well, this time, the hunters didn't push the little deer quite so hard, for they had their orders this time simply to follow him. And towards nightfall, they were in the part of the forest that the huntsman recognized. And the huntsman, who had seen the little deer knock on the door before, took the king straight to the hut. And the king came to the door, and he knocked on the door, and he said, "Sister deer, let me in." And the door opened, and much to his surprise, what he found standing there was a beautiful young woman. Well, you can imagine that sister was quite surprised to see at the door not her brother the fawn, but instead a handsome young man with a gold crown on his head. Well, the king looked at the young woman and he said, "You are by far the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and if you have a deer living with you, then you must be a very gentle person. I would bet that you will be a very good queen. Will you marry me?" And she said, "Well, I don't know. Perhaps." And just then the fawn came running into the hut and ran up beside his sister. And she bent over and she gave him a hug, and she said, "If I go with you to be your queen, then my dear must come with me. And he must always stay with me and never be in any danger." Well, the king really wanted this beautiful, gentle young woman to be his bride, so he agreed readily. And the young sister went and she fetched her little leash that she had made for her brother, the deer, and she placed it on him, just so that they wouldn't get lost in the forest. And she went back to the castle with the king and his people. And they were married. And they were very happy together. And several years passed. And the queen was going to have a baby. Now, their stepmother, the witch, had assumed that her stepchildren had gotten lost in the forest. She assumed that the sister had been torn to bits by wild beasts, and that the brother, who she knew had been turned into a deer, had been killed by hunters. But when she heard the news from the palace that a beautiful young woman and a deer had come to stay with the king, and that the young woman was going to be the queen, she knew that her stepchildren were still alive. Now, by this time, the children's father, unfortunately, had died, But the witch also had a daughter. She was ugly and bitter and not a very nice person. And unfortunately, she only had one eye. Well, her daughter, when she heard that her stepsister had become the queen, began to complain and to whine and to nag about how her mother was so powerful, but instead of her becoming the queen, her sister had become the queen. That nasty, awful do-gooder, so pretty. Well, her mother the witch told her that she simply needed to bide her time because she had a plan. And she did. When the young queen gave birth to a little baby boy, the witch quickly made herself up to look like a chambermaid, somebody who would help out in the queen's room and take care of her and such. For when you have a baby, it's not easy to take care of yourself right afterwards. You need some help. And so the witch went to the queen's chamber and she said, "Your Majesty, it is time for your bath." For she had made a bathtub full of very hot water in the next room. And she took her daughter with her, the girl with just the one eye. And she dressed her up too to look like a chambermaid. And between them, they carried the weak young queen into the bathroom and put her into the tub full of very hot water. And then they built up the fire to make the room very warm and very steamy. And then they closed the door so that the young queen would suffocate. And she did. That night, and then the witch took her own ugly daughter and she put her into the queen's clothes and put her into the queen's bed and put a cap on her head. And she did some magic on her so that she kind of looked like the young queen. But she couldn't fix the fact that her daughter only had one eye. And so she told her daughter to always make sure that she was lying on the side with that eye so that no one would see that she was missing an eye. And when the king came home from his hunting, he found out that his wife had given him a young son. And he was so excited and so happy. And he wanted to go see his wife and to see how she was doing. Well, he went into her chamber to find out how she was doing and to see the new baby. And he saw the new baby and he was a very cute baby. And then he went to his wife's bed and he was now see, in those days, they had big curtains that they would put around the beds because the walls weren't exactly solid. And so there was always a little bit of cold air and wind coming through all the cracks. And so to keep it very warm inside your bed when you went to bed at night, you pulled the curtains around your bed so that it would stay warm and dark and cozy in there while you were sleeping. So the king went up to his wife's bed and he reached to pull aside the curtains. And suddenly the witch, who was still in the room, said, "Oh, no, Your Majesty. Your Majesty, you must not open the curtains. She's so tired and so weak. The light will hurt her eyes. You mustn't open the curtains." And so the young king stood outside and he said, "My dear, how are you feeling?" without opening the curtains. And the witch's daughter from inside answered as sweetly as she could, "Oh, I'm so very tired. I think I just need to sleep for a few days." And so the king said, "Well, all right, my dear. I'll come back and see you in a few days." And so he left. That night, as the old nurse sat rocking in the corner and watching over the baby and the young queen who was supposedly asleep in the bed, in through the door glided, well, she looked like the young queen, but the queen was in the bed, so she couldn't be the young queen, and besides, she was very pale. But she glided in, and the old nurse, she just stopped knitting, and she sat very still and she watched. And the apparition glided in and went right up to the cradle and picked up the baby and fed the baby. And then plumped up the pillows and laid the baby back in the cradle and carefully and gently covered it with the blanket. And then she went over to the deer who lay in the corner by the hearth, and she petted the deer for a little while. And then the apparition stood up and glided back out the door. Well, the next morning, the old nurse went to the guards that were near the door, and she asked them if anyone had come into the room in the middle of the night. And they assured her that nobody had passed them in the middle of the night, not since the king had left the queen's chamber. The old nurse was quite worried by all of that. She thought maybe she was seeing things. But the next night, the apparition visited again and came through the door and fed the baby and petted the fawn and then drifted out again. And this happened for several nights in a row. Until one night, the apparition came in the door and she fed the baby. And as she went over to pet the fawn, she spoke with the voice of the young queen. And she said, "How fares my child, and how fares my fawn? Twice more shall I come, then never again." And then she glided out of the room. Well, the old nurse was quite startled by this. The apparition had never spoken before, and now she knew she had to tell someone. And so she went straight to the king the next morning, and she told him what had been happening for the last week. The apparition would come in, it would feed the baby, and then it would pet the fawn, and then it would leave. But last night it said, "How fares my child, and how fares my fawn? Twice more shall I come, but never again." And the king said, "Well, this is quite strange indeed. I think I shall watch with you tonight, old nurse." And so he came into the room early in the evening, and he hid himself in a dark corner behind some curtains, and he watched. And as the old nurse sat there rocking and knitting, in the door glided the apparition that looked just like his wife. And she came in and she said, "How fares my child, and how fares my fawn? Once more shall I come, then never again." And she fed the baby, and she petted the fawn, and then she drifted out the door again. Well, the king wasn't quite sure what to make of this, but that had definitely been the voice of his wife, and it had certainly looked like her coming through the door. And he still hadn't been allowed to pull the curtains open and see who was in his wife's bed. And so he thought perhaps he would watch again the next night with the old nurse. Well, when he watched with the old nurse the next night, in drifted the apparition through the door, and she said, "How fares my child, and how fares my fawn? This last time shall I come, but never again." And the king just couldn't stand that thought, and he jumped out and he took the apparition by the hand and he said, "Surely, truly, you are my wife." And she looked at him and she smiled, and suddenly, by the grace of God, her skin flushed with color again, and she was given her life back. And she said to him, "Surely and truly, I am your wife." And he said, "Well, then who lies in the bed yonder?" And she said, "Oh, I fear it is my stepsister, and my stepmother, the witch, is the one who has done this." And so the king immediately sent for the witch to come to him, and he put the stepsister under arrest, and they decided that the stepsister and the stepmother must be punished for what they had tried to do to the young queen. And so the stepsister was sent into the forest all by herself and was torn to pieces by wild beasts. And the stepmother, well, she was a witch, so she was burnt. And as soon as she had been burnt to ash, suddenly the enchantment on the young fawn was lifted, and he was a man again. And the sister and brother were so happy to see each other again, and to be able to hug with arms, not with hoofs and legs, and it was wonderful. and they lived very happily. The brother married a wonderful young woman from the court, and they lived very happily together until the end of their days. And that is the story of the brother and the sister. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join us again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page, and we'll have another story for you from somewhere around the world. Have a great day. Bye.